Hey, I'm your host, Bryan. We're going to be talking about boundaries today, both physical and emotional, and what happens when we allow others to cross those boundaries. So, we're going to start off with physical boundaries and how they pertain to our lives. So, your physical boundaries are established when you're young and you have a sort of guideline into adulthood from when you're a child. So, that means physical boundaries are personal space, touch, and awareness of what's appropriate. And that usually starts at around childhood age and works as you get older and you start to assess what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, both physically and socially. And emotional boundaries are like rules about your feelings, their needs, and they separate your own individual feelings about something versus others. They include taking responsibility for your own emotional needs and just your overall emotional needs. And then there's sexual boundaries too, how the matter is discussed, presented, consent, and suggestive terms like, how people joke with you, how they engage with that joking, and images, and how they even touch you. And that kind of crosses into the physical aspect a little bit. But boundaries, both physical and emotional, create guidelines for how you want to be treated, and that's important. And a lot of times we aren't taught what's socially acceptable from childhood age. So as we get older and we become adults, we start to either engage in behavior that would be deemed dangerous or counter to what should be socially acceptable, and we don't really assess that because we weren't taught. So that's one aspect that we need to look at. We need to, especially in social situations, we need to look at how within ourselves we need to start to reflect and say, okay, well, how am I going to approach this situation? Is it acceptable for me to discussing this kind of terminology, this kind of verbiage? Is it societally acceptable to do so? And we kind of have a template for what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. But if you listen and if you listen to podcasts, there's all kinds of books on the subject. There's all kinds of professionals that discuss those boundaries. Both of those boundaries let others know what's acceptable and what's not. So it's kind of important to know where you stand within the realm of your own boundaries. Um, Healthy emotional boundaries avoid burnout, stress, anxiety. So when you're thinking about yourself and you're like, why am I so stressed? Why am I so anxious? I feel constantly tired, emotionally tired. You have to ask yourself, am I letting too many people or too many external factors affect me? Whether it's at the workplace, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's within friendships too, your own friend circle. And a proper level of balance in your boundaries aid in your own self-empowerment and your own self-respect and your own perception of yourself. So if you're constantly letting people cross boundaries with you, you're not going to feel good about yourself. You're going to feel like you're used. You're going to feel anxious. You're going to feel, like, okay, I'm always saying yes when I really want to say no. I'm not comfortable saying no. Why is that? And you have to explore that. You have to sit down and look at why that is. In relationships, both business and even just sexual relationships, you have to look at boundaries, clarify responsibilities in for both parties. So having healthy boundaries in a relationship are, hey, I'm not comfortable when you speak to me like that. Or even in a business world, when you're like, okay, I can't have my boss talking to me crazy. I can't have people engage me in this way. There has to be a certain decorum for business and there has to be a certain perception. And in the business world, you have to both present a perception that is acceptable to both you and parties elsewhere, and then you also have to be received in a certain way. So understanding how your boundaries work allow you to benefit from that. They allow you to not manipulate, but work it in a positive way so that you don't feel like you're being used, so that you don't feel like you're in an unhealthy relationship with yourself. And it limits who has availability to your time, because oftentimes we become yes men, we become the kind of people who just agree with everything just so that we don't disrupt the social norm. And sometimes a healthy boundary will mean taking yourself out of a situation so as to not continue feeling that way, or to cause you to reflect and say, okay, I don't feel good about that. Why is that? And you start to explore that. You start to say, okay, I'm not good in this situation because either I haven't been exposed to enough of it, or maybe I was too exposed at an early age. So if you start noticing you're not comfortable, let's say in a sexually charged environment, you have to ask yourself why. Did something happen to you that caused you to feel that way in a negative way? And the same thing with even positive emotions. Okay, I feel good when I'm around this person. Why is that? Do they affirm something in me? Do they validate my feelings? Do they make me? And then you start to think, okay, that could be positive. That could be good. Maybe that's a healthy relationship you should engage in. But knowing your own boundaries and knowing where you stand, what lines you allow people to cross and not cross, is important. And in the manosphere world, one of the big things that we look at with men is what self-perception, and how a lot of guys don't feel maybe masculine enough, or they feel like they're constantly becoming yes men. And the reason for that is because they've never established a pattern of saying no. You know, when you don't feel like doing something, I know it's hard and it will be met with some kind of contempt, but it's important to learn to say no. You have to say no, because that's when you develop self-respect for yourself. And it does become self-empowering. You start realizing, hey, I don't have to do what this person wants me to do if I'm not comfortable with it. Or I don't have to do what the rest of them are doing. Because if there's a bad social situation, if you have a bad social circle, bad people tend to get into bad situations. And it doesn't mean that there's exceptions. That's the norm. When you look at community, when you look at how people interact with one another, if you're around the good tribe, you'll be another one of them. And we're always talking about, if there's 9 people jumping, you'll be the 10th one. But if there's 9 people studying, you'll be the 10th one. So understanding where your boundaries are in the scope of relationships and society circles makes a difference. But that all starts with you having a good perception of yourself and what you're comfortable with. And when we look at relationships, oftentimes we wonder, okay, why am I so stressed in this relationship? And you look back, if you really think about it and you look within yourself and you look about all the dialogues that you've had with that person, all the interactions, the text messaging, the calls, and you start realizing, going back in your brain, like, wow, that the way they spoke to me made me feel this way, or didn't make me feel this way. And I need to reflect on that. Is that allowing me to step forward in this relationship in a positive way? Am I becoming a better person in that relationship, or am I regressing? Am I getting more withdrawn? Is there something about that relationship that's either toxic or negative that doesn't allow me to grow as a person? And yeah, we all have our bad days. So one difference is a bad day versus a bad relationship. So we have to look at that too. But I think we need to look at ourselves and start setting positive patterns of behavior, or positive boundaries.